Hey guys, welcome back to another video. This is The Hunt Life. We're in the garage today doing a little bit of a gear guide for fishing Florida, anywhere saltwater down south. A lot of people from the Midwest, these northern states, go on vacation, not sure what to take along, and this is why we're doing it, so you know what to take along so you can catch some fish on the beach or wherever you might be fishing down in salt water, the ocean. So we're gonna get after this, go through a bunch of different things, break it down on what we need to bring to catch some saltwater fish. There we go. Woo! All right, guys, so how we're gonna do this is we're gonna break down a couple different types of fishing that we do down in Florida, and I'll kind of just go over the gear that goes along with that type of fishing, and then how we kind of go about doing it, a little bit on what to look for, but mainly covering the gear in this video. Another question you might have to start is, what can I even catch down in the salt water? And there is definitely a big variety of different things that you can catch. If you're fishing the Gulf side, like we do, Southwest Florida, typically we're looking to catch snook, redfish, you can catch black drum, whiting from the beach. You have jack crevalle. You also have your sharks. You do have catfish, and then some other fish we might see is spotted sea trout. We can catch ladyfish, which is a good bait fish. You can also catch mullet and a ton of different varieties of bait fish that we can use for fishing for other fish, which is pretty cool. So a lot of different things we can catch. Now let's dive in and I'll break down these different types of fishing that we do down there. All right, first thing that's probably my favorite is surf fishing from the beach. Surf fishing is pretty common anywhere down in salt water. There's a few different varieties of how to go about it. We'll start off with the rods. I have 9-foot and 10-foot surf rods. My 9-foot rods are actually steelhead rods that I picked up north here around the Great Lakes for steelhead fishing. I know some of the other guys you may have seen on YouTube kind of base their rods off of steelhead rods, which they actually work really great for a lot of the smaller fish, your whiting, your pompano, any of that stuff. Those smaller fish that you can catch from the beach are going to be a really nice fight on that 9-foot steelhead rod. And then I have 10-foot rods. So I have two 10-foot, actually three 10-foot, two 10-foot medium Penn squadrons. Those are awesome couple rods that I picked up a couple years ago, and those work good for a variety of things also. Everything up to sharks, all the way down to, you can still feel the bite, a little fish like whiting or pompano from the beach. So it's a good variety of different fish that you can see the sensitivity on the rod. You can see them biting, but those 10-foot medium rods have some backbone. I caught a shark actually last year that was a 7-foot lemon shark, and that rod handled it perfect. So, and I've talked to other people down there that use the same sort of setups, that 10-foot medium heavy maybe, for targeting those sharks, and it works pretty good. Other than that, if you don't have those, start off with just your regular spinning rod, bring those down, put them in your sand spikes, which we'll talk about here in a second. You don't necessarily need a specific surf rod to start. We'd rather see you catch fish to start and kind of figure it out, and then get the right gear if you get into it. But like I said, I'm using those 9-foot and 10-foot rods just because I've seen that those do work nice. Your rods are up high over the surf. The waves crashing, it kind of keeps your line out of the surf that's crashing onto the beach, and just gets them up away from people too, which is kind of nice. A lot of people usually walking around the beach, so it gets them up in the air, and your lines are angled down towards the water pretty nicely with those taller rods. So since we talked about the rods, we're going to talk about the reels and what we have paired with those 9-foot and 10-foot rods. So for those 9-foot rods, I have them paired with a 4,000 Daiwa reel. Those 4,000 reels are going to get you a little bit more drag and line capacity rather than your typical 2,500 or 3,000 size that you might have on your spinning reel. But the 4,000 size seems to work pretty good for those 9-foot rods. I have that paired with 20-pound braid. I'm using Beyond Braid 8 strand on those, and it's worked pretty good the last year or two. I have no complaints on that. Seems really tough. So you want tougher braid, 20 or 30 pounds for sure, just for that abrasion resistance. Since we are at the beach, which is also nice for casting. That stuff casts pretty smooth. You can launch your rigs out, even though sometimes you might not need to. I found that that 20-pound range works good for me in those 9-foot rods. Moving on to our 10-foot rods and the reels we have paired with those, I have 6,000 size Penn Battle 3s paired with those 10-foot medium Penn Squadrons. That's a really good combination, like I said. If you're going to target bigger fish, sharks, and even just have that peace of mind that if you do hook something, you're going to have a nicer reel paired with that good rod to be able to fight a good sized fish. Those 6,000 size reels are going to have bigger drag rating and more line capacity, and I have 50-pound braid on those, and that seems to be a pretty good poundage for those rods and what I'm using them for. Like I said, any smaller fish you're absolutely good for, and then I did catch that 7-foot lemon shark and had no problems with it, and my line and the rod and reel held up just perfectly, and I was able to fight that fish awesome. So I would say that's a good combination to have for that 10-foot and 6,000 size reel. Moving on to our rigs that we may use for surf fishing. Surf fishing, we can kind of set up a few different ways. We can use cut bait or live bait. We can use live shrimp, dead shrimp, fish bites or fish gum, which is a scent bait. We can find crabs or sand fleas in the surf. Anything like that is going to be awesome bait for the surf compared with our rigs that we have. Each rig's a little different on how you want to kind of set up. First off, we have our catch-all rig or our pompano rig, which is going to have multiple droppers or hooks on the one rig. So this one here is a 2-dropper rig. Some come with 3, some come with 2. These ones here I pre-made, and the little colored part on there is actually the float, so it helps keep that bait up off the bottom. You don't need that. You can just let it hang like it does, but that float is nice to keep it up off the bottom a little bit and get it right in front of those fish's face. So those pompano rigs and catch-all rigs you can make from home if you'd like to. I actually picked up a couple nice kits from Amazon with all the different components, the swivels, the snaps, the floats, just to be able to make my own rigs at home and bring them down there. Even though the rigs aren't going to cost you very much, it's just going to be a couple bucks per rig at the bait store if you want to pick them up. But I like making them myself. It's kind of fun to be able to make your own rig, find your own bait, and catch your own fish. Those pompano rigs usually come with 1/0 or 2/0 hooks on them. So if you're making your own and want to buy some hooks, I would probably go with the 1/0 hooks. If you want to bump up the size and get some 2/0s, that's fine, but mainly that 1/0 hook is going to be your best choice for making those catch-all or pompano rigs. And like I said, there doesn't have to be float on there. You can just have regular straight line to your hook, and it'll just kind of dangle there on your rig. But the one end has a swivel on it, and the one end has a clip on it. The clip end is going to be for your weight that you may use, and there's a couple different weights we'll talk about. And then the swivel is going to tie onto your line of your rod. And then you'll bait up both of your hooks and cast it out there into the surf. Now that we talked about the catch-all or pompano rig, we're going to talk about the Carolina rig. The Carolina rig is a very simple rig that you can also make at home. It is just a chunk of leader. It can be anywhere from 1 foot to 2 feet long, with a hook on one end and a swivel on the other end. These are very simple rigs to tie up on your own, and I'd recommend doing so. It's very simple to do. Just pick up some good leader line, and I would recommend probably 30-pound to 50-pound leader, depending on what you're fishing for. Bigger snook or reds or black drum, that sort of caliber fish, bump it up to 50 pounds if you're using cut bait or live bait. And then those regular smaller size beach fish, you can get away with 30 pounds. That's a good size leader or rig making line for those caliber fish. And that goes along with your pompano rigs and stuff too. Those are usually made out of 30-pound line. Most of the time those are mono. 30-pound mono is what these rigs are being made out of. So that Carolina rig, like I said, chunk of leader, hook on one end, swivel on the other. Then before you tie your line on to your swivel, you would slide a egg weight on there. Egg weight size obviously depends on the current and the tide and the waves and all that. If it's not holding where you want it to, bump up the size of the weight. If you have pretty slack current or not really much going on for tide or, like I said, current, you can probably get away with a lighter one. I'd start off with an ounce or so and move up accordingly. A lot of the times you might end up using a 3 or 4 ounce weight. You could need that just to make it hold in the current. So just experiment with what size. Start a little smaller, and if you notice it drifting or not staying put, bump up that size of weight. And those are the two main rigs I use for fishing on the beach, is that Carolina rig and that Pompano rig. Now kind of talking about the bait we may use on them. That Pompano rig or catch-all rig, we can put shrimp on there, paired with some fish bites or fish gum, that scent bait. Or we can just use plain fish bites by itself if you don't have access to shrimp or sand fleas. If you don't have a sand flea rake, it's going to be hard to find those sand fleas unless the bait shops do have them, which they don't always have. But your best bet for any type of fishing saltwater is finding some shrimp. And also, if they die, make sure to save them, put them in the freezer, and fresh dead shrimp are also a really good bait to use as well. So we're going to pair that shrimp, fish bites, sand fleas, anything like that on those dropper rigs. Those saltwater fish eat all three of those types of baits. If you want to bump up to some bigger bait, maybe some cut bait or some live bait, I would probably recommend using the Carolina rig for those type of bait presentations. Your cut bait is going to be mullet or ladyfish mainly. You can also use pinfish that you may find on the beach, which is a bait fish if you have a cast net, or they do have them at the bait shops. So those pinfish, mullet, ladyfish are going to all be good cut bait to use on those Carolina rigs. And if we are using our bigger Carolina rig with the heavier weight and maybe heavier leader, obviously we're going to need a bigger hook on that. That's where we can use that live bait. If we got some small mullet or even small whiting, those pinfish, all those make great live bait from the beach, which could catch you some big snook, some jacks, some reds, sharks, anything like that. Those bigger fish are going to key in on that cut bait and that live bait. For our Carolina rigs, the hook choice is kind of based off of what we're fishing for. If we're using shrimp on our Carolina rigs, I would say a 1/0 or 2/0 hook is going to be best for that. If we're going to start using cut bait, I would say a 6 or 8/0 hook for sure. We'd want to bump up to just to kind of correlate with the size of fish we'd be catching and the size of the baits we're using. We want to kind of match the size of our hook to the size of the bait. So obviously if we're using bigger bait, we want to use a bigger hook, if that makes sense. So we have hook size, and then we have type of hook. We have our circle hooks, which do not require you setting the hook. The hook just slides into the fish's mouth perfectly, and with some tension or just a steady pull, that fish is going to set itself. So we do not need to set the hook. So that fish is going to get hooked up itself. So those are really good baits, or really good hooks, to use from the surf when our rod's sitting in that rod holder and the fish comes and grabs it. It's just going to end up hooking itself. We can also use octopus hooks, but those do require you setting the hook. So remember that if you're using those different types of hooks, the circle hooks, you do not. You just give it a good steady pull or start reeling, and that fish is just going to have that hook slide into its mouth perfect. Otherwise, those octopus hooks and stuff like that, J hooks, those do require you setting the hook, or any type of jig. Obviously, you need to set that hook. So just remember that variation in the different types of hooks that you use. For all our rigs that we use, just stagger your lines to start. Put some close, put some mid-range, and put some farther out. And wherever you start getting bites, adjust your placement of your rigs in the water based on where you're catching fish. That's about the simplicity of it. Look for some structure on the beach, some cuts, some rips in the current that might be going through a sandbar. There's some different variations in that beach structure that we can look for to help us find those fish. We can also look for birds or bait to kind of help us get an idea where we need to set up. And just be cautious that there is probably going to be people around. Set up to the outside of groups of people, just so you're not in their way and they're not in your way. I know sometimes people can get frustrated with people walking around their lines when they're fishing or swimming around, but just be cautious and move off to the side, and that'll just kind of put yourself away from any commotion that may be happening. But it's going to happen. Don't get too frustrated about it. It is what it is on the beach. And if anything, beat them out there, be earlier or stay later, and get your beach fishing in. So now that we've talked about the rigs and what pound line that are used to make them, and the hooks, and a few of the weights, There's a few different types of weights along with that egg weight that we can use. And this is mainly for the pompano rig, I would say. And those would be pyramid weights or Sputnik weights. So pyramid weights come in a variety of sizes from 1 ounce up to 6 ounces. 6 ounces is going to be pretty heavy, and you'd be using that for more or less really heavy current or a rig that you're using bigger baits that need to stay put. Mainly you're going to be finding yourself using that 2 to 3 ounce pyramid weight, kind of based on obviously the current and the tide. If you notice your line moving in the current and not staying put, like I said again, bump up the size of your weight and try to get that to hold. Keeping it in place is going to be your best bet for not getting everything tangled up, and just making sure you got good tension to that rig for your best chance at catching fish. The Sputnik weights have wires coming off of the lead. So the middle piece is for connecting your line to or with your clip on your rig. Those wires really just help that weight dig into the sand and keep that bait secure in place. I have a couple 2 ounce and a couple 4 ounce. And again, just play around with what's going on with the current and upgrade that size if you need to get that bait to hold. Just a recap on the bait for all these rigs, just in case you missed it. For the pompano rig, we can use fish bites or fish gum, shrimp that's live or dead. We could use live bait on a pompano rig if we don't have any floats on our droppers. It wouldn't be a bad idea to try some live bait flashing around. That could catch you some fish as well. Otherwise, we can put chunks of cut bait on those, which would need to be smaller because those pompano rigs are usually intended for catching smaller fish. If you've caught some crabs or have a sand flea rake and can dig up some sand fleas in the surf, those are also great baits to put on those pompano rigs to catch you some fish. And that's about it for that pompano rig. For our Carolina rigs, we can use shrimp, we can use cut bait, and I've listed those types of cut bait, which could be mullet or ladyfish or pinfish. You know, we're looking to cut off a nice little chunk and put it on our bait. So I mean, typically we're looking for something about that size, maybe like 2 to 3 inch square cut bait to use on that Carolina rig. Then if we have a bigger hook and bigger leader size, we can definitely use a bigger chunk of cut bait, or we can go to that live bait as well. If you have access to a cast net, that's going to be an awesome way to catch your own bait. A variety of white bait you can catch, which is going to be greenbacks or threadfin herring. It's all that bait that looks white. That's why it's called white bait. A variety of sizes, anywhere from probably 3 inches up to 5 inches. Then we can catch those mullet and maybe even some ladyfish in that cast net as well. And that's all going to be great bait for you to use on the beach. If you brought your spinning rod to the beach, feel free to cast that around with a spoon or a swim bait just to try to be able to catch fish to use for bait right there fresh on the beach. It's not a bad idea while you're waiting for bites to cast your spinning rod around in the surf and see what you can catch. You can use a variety of different lures for that. And we'll kind of talk about that once we get into some of the different types of casting we can do. A few more things just to kind of wrap up that surf fishing aspect of the beach. You're going to want some sand spikes. These are going to hold your rods in place. You're not going to have to be fumbling around trying to figure out a spot to set them up. Those sand spikes are either metal or PVC. A lot of the time you can just cut up a couple of chunks of PVC, bring that along with you, have one side angled to help it go into the sand. You can either pound it in with a rubber mallet or just wiggle it into the sand. Either works. It's just going to give you a spot to hold that rod. You can spread them out a little bit along the beach and give you a good secure spot to keep your rods upright. And you can also buy them at the store. They're only going to cost you anywhere from 10 to 12 bucks depending on what you get. But you can get a couple good sand spikes, and it's definitely a necessity for beach fishing. To keep your shrimp alive that you might find at the bait store, or even some sand fleas or other little bait fish that you might catch, it's good to have a bait bucket. Whether it's just a 5-gallon bucket with an aerator and a lid, just fill it up with water and be able to put that bait fish in there. Otherwise, you can get a nice insulated bait bucket. That's going to help keep that water cooler and keep those fish alive or bait alive longer for you. Again, along with that aerator. And that is definitely a necessity to be paired with that bait bucket is an aerator. Having a good knife is also a good tool to have, and a good pliers. We're going to need those couple things for obviously de-hooking, cutting up our cut bait, or any other thing we might need to cut up on the beach. And then we're going to need a mode of transportation to get all this stuff out to the beach. So I would recommend picking up a beach cart, or even like Walmart or some of these stores sell these nice little folding carts that have the big beach tires on them that are a little more reasonable price than those expensive fishing beach carts. So pick yourself up a cart, you can put all your gear in there and be able to haul it nicely to the beach. The last thing really quick I want to talk about in the surf fishing section is fishing for sharks from the beach. Obviously, I talked about when we talked about our rods, being able to have that heavier rod to be able to catch some bigger fish. So if you're going to fish for sharks from the beach, number one, before you even think about doing so, you'll need to go on the Florida fishing website and take your shore-based shark fishing course. This is a legal requirement that you need to do if you're targeting sharks from the beach. It actually gives you a really good amount of information to help you know what you're doing while you're shark fishing from the beach. So once you have that and your fishing license, we can then take our big rods to the beach. We're going to want to upgrade our rigs a little bit. We're going to want to use some wire leader, or some rigs may have some really heavy mono. This rig here that I'm going to show you is a custom rig that I made at home here. It's a 124-pound wire leader material, and it's about a 5-foot chunk of leader. One end we have our 14-aught circle hook on it. Just find a good quality hook. This one is a Mustad hook. It doesn't really matter what you buy, just make sure it's a good quality circle hook. So that's going to loop through there with the wire, and we're going to crimp that on with a nice little wire crimp. Next thing in line on our wire is going to be a little bead, and that's just going to keep our egg weight here from smashing into that crimp and possibly ruining our wire. And that could, after it does it a bunch of times, it might break that wire. So that's why we just want that bead there to keep it from banging into the crimp. Our weight on here is typically a 5 or 6 ounce egg weight. That's going to keep that bigger bait in place. Some places you may shark fish have maybe a little bit more current. Otherwise, we just want to make sure that bait is secure and that it slides on the wire so that fish can take a little bit without feeling it right away. And then on the other end of our egg weight, we have another bead over to our swivel, which is also looped through and crimped on with a wire crimp. We would tie on our line to that swivel, and then that's our rig. So we take a big piece of cut bait, which could be a jack or ladyfish or mullet or anything like that you may have caught earlier in the day. Otherwise, you can find some stuff at bait shops, which you could find some bonita, which you could chunk up, some kite wings, which are stingray wings, which actually work really well if they have them available. Otherwise, they might have some other varieties of frozen bait that do work good for shark fishing. Just about anything is going to work good for shark fishing. That big one I talked about earlier that I caught was actually caught on a chunk of catfish. So one of the catfish we had caught earlier in the day, we saved it for shark bait, cut it right behind the spines, and just hooked on the tail and middle section all in one. It was a nice little chunk of bait, and that caught that 7-foot shark. That's my biggest one I've caught so far. So it really can be anything. The more bloody, oily scent that you can get out in the water, the better. So that's why those ladyfish, bonita, that kind of stuff, guys typically tend to use. Just something that's going to really give some scent in the water for those sharks to key in on. And again, in case you missed it, we're pairing that rig with 50-pound braid at minimum. We can always go bigger on that. And then a 6,000 or even 8,000, 10,000 sized reel with that 10-foot medium or even medium heavy casting rod. If you have a conventional setup, that's a little different because we can't necessarily cast that, but if you're going to plan on kayaking or something like that, that's a little bit different setup. But this is just for our heavy spinning rod setup for casting these baits from the beach. I do not currently have any conventional setups for shark fishing. That might come down the line, but this has worked good for me so far for the time we're down there. And it gets us a good variety of probably 3 to 7 foot sharks. So that's fun just in itself. Well, I don't really need to catch anything bigger. Obviously my gear probably isn't cut out for it, so that's okay. I've snapped off on one really big shark that cut right through that wire leader. Definitely wasn't ready and didn't have the right gear to fight that one, but that's okay. We'll catch him another day. Last thing I'm going to mention about shark fishing is kind of the location we want to look for. Any spot from the beach is probably going to be okay. Majority of the time, shark fishing is going to take place in the evening or at night. And if you can get your baits out far enough, they'll even bite during the day for sure. Or if you have access to some deeper water in a spot, maybe around a pass or an inlet where that water can get deeper, they might bite all day. So just find a spot that's going to have some moving water, maybe a little bit deeper water. Set up your rods on the beach for some sharks, and man, you'll have a good time. Two things for strike indicators for shark fishing that I do like to have with me are glow sticks, which you just hang on the very top eyelet of your rod, and usually they just pop off right away. If they don't, you can just kind of shake them off the top of your rod. That just gives you a nice bright indicator for fishing at night to be able to see that fish bite. Or you can clip on a little bell and put that towards the top of your rod to be able to hear that bite as well when it happens. So a couple strike indicators are definitely good to have, or even some little lights they do make for shark fishing. Moving on to the next segment here that we're going to talk about, and that's wading the flats. So there's a lot of different areas on the saltwater, Florida, Southwest Florida, where we go, where there's big areas of shallow flats. What we're looking for there is grass patches, current seams where the water gets a little deeper, but we can still wade out to there. Any variations in depth, we're kind of looking for those fish. We're sight fishing for those fish, casting around through those grass flats. And typically the water is only going to be calf deep, ankle deep, knee deep, depending on where you wade, obviously. But we can wade around these big flats and look for those types of structure, and that's where those fish are going to be hiding. So also you can look for bait fish, and that's going to be a good way to indicate there's some fish around. Then just those different structure variations we'll kind of want to try to key in on and pay attention on those different changes to be able to find some fish. So when we go wading the flats, the rods we're going to be using for this is just your typical spinning rod. If you're from up north, Midwest, you are definitely going to have some sort of spinning rod that's heavier for walleye or northern that you might be fishing for up here. So I would recommend a 7-foot, give or take a few inches, doesn't really matter too much. A 7-foot medium heavy action rod with a quicker tip, so a faster tip on that. This rod here is a 13 Fishing Fate series. It's a medium heavy, fast tip, and it works really good for this type of fishing. I have that paired with a 3,000 size Daiwa and 15-pound braid on here. Again, you can definitely use heavier braid, but this is just what I had on here from fishing up north, and it works really good. I really do like a high-vis color line for a lot of different applications, whether it be surf fishing, wading, or even fishing back at home. That high-vis line is really nice to be able to see your line and what it's doing in the water. So from our main line, which is going to be usually braid, and I would recommend that braided line just for your abrasion resistance. So from our main line, which is going to be our braid, we're going to be attaching a chunk of leader on the end before we put on our bait. And that's typically going to be anywhere from 20 to 50 pound, either mono or fluorocarbon leader. If we're fishing for fish that are maybe a little bit more finicky, or you think they're maybe seeing your line or something like that, that 20-pound is going to be okay for that. But almost all these fish down in the salt water have teeth, and they're going to end up fraying up your line after even one or a couple bites on your lure. So every time we do catch a fish, we want to make sure to check that little section of line right above our lure and make sure it's not frayed up. I would start at 30 pounds, but if you want to bring 20 pounds along, that is totally fine. You can definitely use that. But if you run into problems, just bump it up. I typically do bring 20, 30, and 50 pound line width. If you're seeing some bigger fish or wanting to target some bigger fish, go right to 50. You're not going to be disappointed with that. That's going to keep you from breaking off and give you a lot more to work with that heavier pound leader. And whatever you like to use for leader material, I'm not going to tell you what to buy. For saltwater, I just picked up a couple of those big rolls of big game line. That's 30 and 50 pounds, and I just had some other 20 pounds on a smaller spool that I picked up. But any type of line that you prefer is going to work great for you. The reason why we use that braid on our reel is we're going to have some awesome castability with that, especially wading the flats. Sometimes we do want to bomb cast just because those fish could have the chance of seeing us. So we want to try to really reach out and cast as far as we can sometimes, just so those fish can't see us. But that's not always necessary. They may hit right next to your feet. So some of the lures that we can use for wading the flats, are your typical swim baits. And most of the time I'm using, at the smallest, a 3-inch swim bait all the way up to maybe a 5-inch swim bait. Typically that 4-inch size is going to be your perfect bet, so if you're looking for that number to buy, I would look for that 4-inch swim bait. Those come in a variety of different colors and configurations. Once you're kind of familiar with what bait fish are in the area, it's not a bad idea to try to match what those bait fish are by the type of swim bait color you have on. But typically your pearls, your silvers, your more natural looking or flashy colors are going to be just fine. If you have some darker stained water, a darker color is going to probably be good too. These few colors I have here are typically what I bring along with me, and they catch a ton of fish for us when we're down there. So now if you're using swim baits, you're going to have some jigs, swim bait jigs along. Anywhere from probably at minimum an 1/8 ounce, but I would say 1/4 ounce and 3/8 ounce are going to be the most used. If you're finding yourself casting longer or fishing a little deeper water, I would definitely try to use that 3/8 ounce. Just kind of get a feel for it. Have a couple extras along of a few different sizes, and obviously if there's a little bit of a current, you might need a little bit heavier of a jig. So play around with that as well. It's just based off of how it feels, that current, and the kind of the depth of water you're working with. Another good one to bring along that you probably have in your tackle box is some jerk baits, some twitch baits, some X-Wraps, anything like that. That's that 4 to 5 inch size is going to work really well. Again, those flashier colors, anything like that is going to work great in salt water, and we can twitch those, straight retrieve, and those cast really well out on the flats. So that's another great lure to use. Spoons are one I mentioned when I was talking about the beach fishing. A lot of these bait fish that you may see are really flashy and darty, so those spoons are what a lot of guys use. Your gold or silver spoons, and some might have some holographic or something on there, but all that kind of stuff is going to work great. I would probably for sure use anywhere from a 1/2 ounce up to a 2 ounce spoon, and those are going to cast really well for you. And again, you can kind of pop those or reel those straight, play around with a couple of different variations on that retrieve, and just find what works and what the fish are keying in on. This kind of goes along with swim baits that I forgot to mention, but they do make some artificial looking shrimp that have a weighted head in them, or a weighted jig head in them. This one here is a voodoo shrimp, and I've had a lot of good luck on these actually. You can pick them up in the bait stores down there or buy them online in different color variations, but these are also a very good bait to use. And like I said before, those shrimp are going to be a good bait because everything in the ocean eats them. So if we can replicate that with a soft plastic, that's going to be a good choice as well. A couple other ones that are not as popular are going to be like bucktail jigs like this here. I always bring a few along, but never tend to really use them too much. And then also I would recommend bringing along some top waters, some spook style baits that you can twitch on top. You can catch a lot of different fish on those. Some low light conditions or overcast days usually work better for top water bites, but if you see a fish servicing up or a bait school that the fish are blowing up on, cast the top water in there and you might hook into something pretty awesome. So a few last things for that wade fishing is bring a little tackle box along, like I said, with some extra jigs, some extra terminal tackle in there, just in case you get broken off, so you have some extras with you. That's definitely a good little thing to have with you. And put that in a backpack or a little waterproof bag so it doesn't get wet, and you can carry a few things along with you like your pliers and maybe a stringer to keep some fish if you want, or if you have a little backpack cooler and you can put a few things in there along with your tackle box and some extra soft plastics or whatever you might have. That would be a good option as well. So you can put some ice in there, put your fish in there, keep a little tackle box and some extra stuff, and that would be a good thing to keep with you when you're wading around. And the best thing that is going to give you the most advantage out on the flats is a good pair of sunglasses. Obviously we want to have our sun protection on too for not getting burnt, but to be able to see is probably the best thing that you can have working in your favor out on those flats. All right, so we talked about surf fishing from the beach. We talked about wading the flats. Now we're going to talk about just walking the beaches actually. And that kind of goes along with that surf fishing, but we can use that spinning rod like we talked about out on the beach. We can cast a variety of those different baits like we talked about that we can use on the flats in the surf and catch all the different types of fish that I listed. So If you see some fish cruising the beach, sometimes they might be really close to the beach, like those snook or some reds. Cast at them, you can sight fish, or you can just blind cast the beach as well, and you might hook up with some mackerel or some ladyfish or some jacks just by casting those spoons or swim baits out into the surf. So that's definitely a good thing, like I said, to bring your spinning rod out to the beach with you, because then you can walk around, or you can just go for a walk down the beaches in the morning or evening and try to look for those fish and just cast around. It's definitely a fun way to do it. One additional lure though for that I have in my box, it's called a gotcha lure. It's a heavier weighted lure that you can mainly twitch or even straight retrieve. It's going to be kind of like a blade bait sort of up north. You want to reel that, pop it off bottom. There's a few different variations on how we can retrieve that. A lot of the times if we just crank it as fast as we can, straight retrieve, those fish are going to come slam it too. So play around with your retrieve on that. There's a couple different sizes that you can buy of these type of lures, and they're all going to catch you some fish. Moving on to our last category that I want to talk about, and I'm going to kind of group these all into the same category, and that is bridge fishing, pier fishing, fishing jetties, and maybe fishing around those passes. Along Florida, there's a variety of different keys that we have different roads and bridges and jetties sticking out from, and in between these keys, there's usually water flowing through a pass, and those can be great places to catch bait and catch game fish. We can try a lot of those different areas with our spinning rod. We might want a little bit heavier of a rod if we're trying to hoist fish up onto something like a pier or a bridge, but a lot of the same tackle and gear that we talked about is going to work good for that. And actually, our Carolina rigs work very well for around that kind of structure, and especially if there's some good current. We can pair that with some shrimp and be able to catch a lot of fish on a Carolina rig around those bridges or piers, catch sheep's head and snook, and a lot of those different predator fish like hiding under that structure or near that structure. And then we, like I said, we can catch some of those different species like sheep's head or even some snapper, which we didn't talk about yet, but they relate to that structure more or less, rather than those beaches. You will find them there, but you're gonna have a better chance of catching them near that structure. And in addition to those structure, we can also cast some mangroves. So those mangrove edges, those fish hide up underneath there. So we can cast those edges as well. If they're near any of this other type of structure or beaches that we're fishing, feel free to cast those mangrove edges. Obviously, we want a higher tide with this because then they can hide underneath there. If it's a lower tide and all the roots are exposed, it's not really that great of fishing. So I would key in on something else structure-wise if it's a lower tide. Another good rig to use is just a jig. There's some snapper jigs or different variations of jigs that we can use with a chunk of shrimp or a chunk of bait on there that we can cast around those pilings or those in the current and catch fish like that too. Again, play around with a couple different sizes on your weights or size of jigs. Just take a look at a bait shop and ask questions on what you should be using around that type of structure. And again, you'll want to have that leader on your bait, and probably that 30-pound leader at least if you're fishing around structure like that, because there is barnacles and stuff around any sort of pilings or rocks. You want that little bit heavier leader in case you run that line on those rocks or those fish may take you in the rocks briefly, just to have that peace of mind that you're not going to get broken off as easy. And then if you are, like I said, bump it up higher to 50-pound. And there is a different variation of the Carolina rig, which is just your hook and the egg weight right after your hook. So we usually typically use a smaller egg weight, like maybe a 1/8 or 1/4 ounce egg weight right next to our hook with our live bait on it. And that's just to get it some weight, kind of like a jig, but that line is still able to slide on that egg weight, unlike a jig. And that's a good rig to use for sheep's head and just around that kind of bridge or pier structure. So for those piers, bridges, jetties, passes, we can use our spinning rod. We can use live bait, which is our shrimp or our bait fish, and just play around. You might see other people catching fish on a certain thing, and try to catch that same bait or get that same bait and replicate it for yourself, and they'll probably produce some fish. So guys, that just about wraps up everything that we have here for you. The different varieties of fishing that we can do down in the saltwater. Obviously, based off the different locations you can go, try to apply these different tactics to that area. Always feel free to ask questions at the bait shops or to other people out fishing. A lot of the times people are very friendly and willing to share that information with you to get you on some fish. A few last things before we go here, kind of more or less on how to find these areas I'm talking about. Go on your phone, bring up Google Maps. If you have Navionics, bring up that as well, and you can see a lot of this different structure and a lot of these different areas we talked about from those maps. So do a little bit of map research, pin some spots that you want to go try, and that's going to help you kind of key in on a few spots to go fishing. So we talked a little bit earlier on how to catch your own bait. If you do have access to a cast net, that is an awesome way to throw it around and catch some bait to use. There's some demonstrations on how to throw a cast net of the different sizes, and I would recommend staying towards that 5 or 6 foot cast net. That's going to be more manageable for you to throw than a big 10-foot net, and it's a lot harder to throw though. So stick to like a 5 or 6 foot cast net if you do end up getting one. And another variation on catching bait fish, which you do not need a net for, is they're called sabiki rigs. So they're a bunch of little hooks with very mini size bait fish looking presentation, which you just hook a weight on the one end and then hook it onto your line on the other. And there's usually about 8 to a dozen little hooks on there that we can jig up and down on the piers or by bridges or anywhere there's a little bit deeper water that we can see some bait fish or know that they're there. We can jig that up and down, and those smaller bait fish key in on that, and that's what they're eating. So those smaller little micro size things, and you can usually end up catching a few at a time on those sabiki rigs, which is a good way to catch some bait for yourself other than a cast net. And again, make sure you bring your bait bucket along to keep those fresh baits alive. And saving those fish that you may think are trash fish, if you catch them like ladyfish or jacks, save them for shark bait or cut bait on the beach. That can definitely catch you a lot of big fish. Using those fish you caught with your spinning rod, maybe on the flats or by the bridges, be sure to save a few to try for cut bait for some bigger fish. Last but not least, and this is a good tool to have right on your phone, it's the Florida Wildlife and Conservation app, which you can download and log into your account and create an account with your licenses right visible on your phone. So that's a good thing to have there. And it also has all the regulations on saltwater and freshwater fish, so you can use it as a quick access guide on knowing the size and regulations of the different fish you might catch. Bring in a bigger cooler to have in your vehicle with some ice on it to keep those fish from spoiling. Might also be a good option if you catch a bunch of fish and need to transport them or keep them someplace for an extended period of time. Having a bigger cooler like that might be of benefit if you're trying to keep multiple fish cold or some bigger fish cold. It just helps, like I said, prolong them from spoiling, and you're just taking care of that meat. Well, thanks for sticking with us, guys, for this gear guide on fishing the saltwater. We really hope you got some good information out of this and stuff that you can use and apply to your own situation down fishing the saltwater. And we really hope you're able to catch some fish with these tools, tips, gear that we talked about today. So thanks for watching. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you have a question about something else or something I may not have covered, feel free to comment and I'll try to answer those questions for you with the best of my knowledge. And if you're not a follower of the channel, feel free to subscribe to the channel. We hope to have more fishing videos in Florida, and then we have a lot of content from up in the northern Midwest, Wisconsin, and around the Great Lakes. So we hope you enjoy that if you do follow along. Thank you very much for watching this video, guys. I'm Brandon again from The Hunt Life, and we'll see you on the next one.